I was at the little table in my rental, the one that wobbled if you leaned on it, staring at numbers that wouldn't line up. The place was outside a small Wyoming town. My phone was open to my bank balance, and the notepad in front of me had the same 4 words I'd been rewriting all week. Rent, gas, groceries, phone, like changing the order might change the answer. It didn't. Every time I totaled it, the gap was still there. The pressure wasn't dramatic, it was steady. My mom was in a nursing home, and they didn't care about my reasons. They cared about the due date. A bed costs money every day whether your life is behaving or not. I'd been keeping up by working extra hours at the farm and telling myself I'd catch my breath later. Then, later showed up and the air was gone. "Mr. James, we need a payment today to keep your mom's account current," Linda said quietly. "I'm not dodging you. I'm just trying to get ahead of it," I said, trying to stay calm. After that call, the apartment felt smaller. I grabbed my keys and drove out to my old job anyway, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The road was the same 2-lane stretch through flat land and winter brown fields. I kept expecting to see the usual: trucks in the yard, lights in the shop, somebody leaning on a gate with coffee. Instead, the front gate was chained, not the normal latch, a heavy chain, like someone wanted it noticed. There was a notice taped to the office window, paper curling at the corners, big print, legal language, a phone number. The yard looked like the day got interrupted. Equipment parked crooked, tools left out, no voices, no movement. It still smelled like hay and diesel. The place looked normal in pieces, like it was pretending. A half-open feed lid, a broom on the concrete, boot prints in dried mud. All of it said people had been here, then suddenly hadn't, and nobody bothered to explain it to the guys who did the work. I was owed pay. A couple weeks, maybe more. I knew I wasn't the only one. When things go bad out here, they don't pick favorites. I called Dale anyway, because you call even when you already know the answer. It rang until it didn't. Then his voicemail picked up. "Payroll's not in my hands anymore," Dale said flatly in a voicemail. I sat in my truck and looked at the chain on the gate like it could explain itself. I could have gotten mad. I could have driven to his house and pounded on his door. None of that would put money in my account today. The nursing home wasn't going to wait while I argued with a man who'd already lost control of his own place. I needed cash now, not a promise, not a soon, not a call back. On the drive back toward town, something in me flattened out, not hopeless, just practical. If a job showed up that paid fast, I was going to take it. Ugly hours, long drive, whatever. I didn't have room left to be picky. I wasn't looking for a good decision. I was looking for a way to keep my mom where she was and keep myself from getting thrown out. I found the posting in a grocery store parking lot with my phone plugged into a cable that only charged if I didn't touch it. I wasn't scrolling for entertainment. I was hunting for something that paid fast because later it stopped being a plan and turned into a threat. Overnight lambing and kidding watch, fence checks, high pay, paid per night, 3 nights only. Start tonight. It read like somebody who actually owned the place wrote it. No perks, no sweet talk, just the work and the hours nobody wanted. It hooked me because it fit what I already knew how to do. I'd done seasonal ranch work. I'd watched births, kept notes, and learned how to stay calm when an animal decided to turn a normal night into a mess. I'd used a fence tester, replaced insulators, and learned the hard way that one sloppy step around a live fence can ruin your whole season. You don't forget the bite of it, or the way your brain keeps replaying the moment you got careless. I hit call before I could talk myself out of it. The man who answered didn't ease into anything. He gave his name once, Marshall Vance, like that was the only introduction he was willing to spend. "I can work," I said. "I've done lambing watches. I keep a log." 3 nights, I pay at sunrise, Marshall said. After that, he ran through quick check questions, more like boxes he needed to tick, jug pens, iodine, when to call a vet, whether I had the sense not to walk a fence line in the dark trying to play hero. I told him I wasn't looking to prove anything. I was looking to get through the night and keep animals alive. He made a small sound, like that was the only answer he was willing to accept. He gave directions like a man who'd had people get lost and waste his time. County road off the highway, cattle guard, second gate, not the first. If I hit an old windmill, I'd gone too far. He told me to screenshot the map because cell service would drop after the last string of mailboxes. Then he ended the call like it was a tool he'd put back in its place. I sat there staring at my cracked screen. My bank balance was still the same ugly number. My mom's bill was still due. The farm I'd been working at was still chained shut, and the pay I'd earned was still floating in somebody else's wreckage. This job didn't fix any of that. It just bought time, and right then time was the only thing I could afford. I drove out with what gas I could afford, watching the needle like it was a countdown. The farther I got, the less the world looked like it had room for extra people. Buildings thinned, lights got scarce, and the land opened until the sky felt too big at the same time. Every now and then I'd pass a porch light miles away, and it would vanish behind me like it never existed. Out on the high plains, dusk doesn't hang around. It just slips away. Wind pushed at the side of my truck like it wanted to herd me off the road. When I turned onto gravel, the tires got loud and the rest of the world got quiet. My phone dipped from 1 bar to none, and no service sat there like a shrug. I dialed the nursing home out of habit, not expecting an answer, and got nothing but dead air. It wasn't a warning. It was just how it worked out here. The cattle guard clanked under me. Fence posts flashed in the headlights. I passed the first gate and kept going like he'd said. The second gate was set back farther than it looked from the road, half hidden by a shallow dip in the land. The chain wasn't locked, just looped, like the place relied on distance more than hardware. I opened it, drove through, and shut it behind me. The latch clicked, and I didn't like how final it sounded. The farm showed up in pieces, low and practical. A barn, a couple sheds, pens laid out in straight lines, fence running out until it disappeared into flat dark. Nothing about it screamed haunted. It was just isolated, the kind of isolated you can feel in your teeth. Somewhere out in the pens a goat bleated, sharp and annoyed, and another answered from farther off. A bell chimed once, faint and distant, then went quiet again. I parked on packed dirt near a yard light that barely earned the name. When I killed the engine, the silence rushed in. No highway hum, no neighbor noise, nothing but wind and animals and the faint creak of metal settling. I sat there a beat too long, hands on the wheel, telling myself I'd done this before, and that 3 nights was just 3 nights. Marshall was in the yard by his truck, loading a duffel like he was leaving on a deadline. Up close, he looked mid-40s, maybe older if you counted sun and cold. Heavy coat, work gloves, boots that looked like they'd never been clean a day in their life. He checked a pen latch, then checked it again like it was muscle memory. His eyes moved fast, always landing on gates and corners, like he didn't trust the place to stay the same when he looked away. "You're Hunter James?" Marshall said, clipped. "Yeah," I said. "Hunter, appreciate you taking me on short notice." "Funeral's out of town," Marshall said. "I'm gone 3 days. Do what I tell you and we won't have problems." That last part wasn't a threat. It sounded like a man stating the rules of gravity. He handed me a ring of keys, a handheld radio, and a small flashlight with a red lens already clipped on. When the yard light hit his hand, I saw the scar clearly, an old pale line, the kind you'd expect from wire or a bad angle with a tool. Ranch work leaves marks. I didn't stare. I just noticed the way he kept that hand close to his body, like he still remembered the moment it happened. He walked me through what I needed without turning it into a tour. The kidding shed sat off to one side, low and plain, built for function and nothing else. He pointed out where the logbook would be, where the long gloves hung, where the iodine was, where extra straw was stacked. He showed me the fence tester and the spare batteries like he expected them to matter. He didn't say anything spooky. He was just too exact about it, like the difference between fine and bad could come down to one small choice in the dark. When he finished, he stood by his truck with the engine already warming, like he was cutting the last tie before he left. He didn't offer a speech. He promised the one thing I could actually use: 3 nights, paid at sunrise. He didn't sell me a story. He sold me a job, and that's why I believed him. Marshall didn't give me a grand tour. He gave me the kind of walkthrough you do when you've got one boot already in the truck and you're trying not to forget the thing that'll cost you later. He moved fast, shoulders tucked against the wind, eyes cutting back to the pens even while he talked. The yard light threw hard shadows. Everything beyond it was already turning into flat, cold dark. He took me straight to the kidding shed, low, plain, built to block weather more than impress anyone. Inside, the air held a little warmth and the smell of hay and animals. Goats shifted in their bedding, heads lifting when the door opened, then settling once they decided we weren't there to move them. Along one wall were the jug pens, small panels set up to keep a doe and her kid together after birth. Marshall rattled a latch and made sure I saw how it seated. He pointed to stacked straw bales and a corner with extra panels leaning, ready to set up fast. Right by the door, he ran through supplies like a checklist: long gloves in a box, iodine in a brown bottle, clean bottles and nipples in a tote, paper towels, a small kit with lubricant, and a couple tools you keep for a bad presentation, not a normal one. Heat lamps hung on chains above 2 corners, unplugged. He paused under them just long enough that I understood the point. He showed me where the red lens flashlight belonged, hanging on a hook next to spare batteries in a taped bag. Then he pointed at the logbook, cheap spiral notebook inside a clear sleeve, on a shelf where you couldn't miss it. He tapped it once with a knuckle. Out here, memory gets slippery at 3 in the morning. Writing it down is how you keep the night from turning into a blur. Outside again, he spread a printed map on the hood of his truck and held it down with one gloved hand. 3 spots were circled in marker. He named them by landmarks, not coordinates, and handed me a fence tester. He showed me the screen, then told me the minimum safe kilovolts he expected to see. He didn't talk about coyotes or thieves. He talked about what happens when the number drops and you pretend you didn't notice. Then he walked me over to the dogs. Chip was lean and alert, eyes too smart to ever fully relax. Boone was bigger, heavier, the kind that didn't waste energy. Marshall pointed out their water and feed and said, plain as weather, that if either dog refused a gate, you didn't force it. He wasn't trying to scare me off. He needed someone to cover 3 nights, and he talked like it was procedure. Do this, don't do that. Keep it simple. Keep it safe. Still, I caught things. The way he kept one hand close, the pale scar across his knuckles, the way he checked his watch like he wanted to be rolling before the dark fully settled in. That's when he handed me the sheet. 1 page, clean print, 6 rules, spaced like a checklist, the kind you could read at a glance with dirty hands. No story, no long explanation, no threats. The paper looked new, but the rules felt old, like they'd been rewritten, trimmed down, made sharper. Read it, then read it again, Marshall said, not threatening, just certain. I did. Once, then again. 6 lines, no drama, just orders that sounded like common sense until you realized how specific they were. Write your notes in the log right where you stand. Keep the shed on red light unless you're actively helping a birth. If the white overhead is on when it shouldn't be, shut it off and listen before you step in. Check the fence at the 3 marked points and don't go walking the line alone in the dark. If you hear a bell running fast while the shed goes too quiet, stop at the threshold and look from the light first. And if Chip or Boone won't cross a gate, neither do you. Every line sounded like safety procedure. The kind of thing you'd tell a new hire because you didn't want animals hurt and you didn't want a bad night to turn into a wreck. But the way he watched me rid wasn't casual. He was checking if I'd follow it when I was tired and tempted to cut corners. I looked up at him, keeping my tone level. "It's just me tonight?" I asked. "It's just you," Marshall said. He didn't say it like a scare tactic. He said it like a fact. Then he went back to practical details, where the keys hung, which latch liked to pop if you didn't seat it, where the first aid kit sat, where the extinguisher was mounted. He told me the vet number was written in the front of the logbook. He didn't promise he'd pick up if I called. He didn't promise anything except what he'd already said on the phone. He'd pay at sunrise. By the time he finished, the last strip of light on the horizon was fading. Marshall checked his watch, climbed into his truck, and started the engine. Headlights washed across the pens, and for a second, the goat's eyes flashed back like glass. Then he rolled down the drive, and the taillights shrank into 2 red dots. Then nothing. I stood there with the rule sheet in my hand and the radio clipped to my jacket. The yard light hummed. Wind moved through wire and boards. The place was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like everything was waiting for me to make my first choice. After Marshall's taillights vanished, I stood in the yard for a second longer than I meant to. The light over the packed dirt hummed and threw a hard circle around my boots. Past that, the farm was mostly shapes and wind. Somewhere in the pens, a goat complained and another answered, and the sound carried like the air had nothing to catch on. I forced myself to move. Standing still out there felt like wasting a chance I'd paid for with panic. I went back to the shed and started setting up the way I always did on night watches, like muscle memory could keep my head straight. I checked the red lens on the flashlight and made sure it actually held its setting. I laid the long gloves where I could grab them without digging. I set the iodine and the towels together, not because I expected trouble right away, but because if you wait until you need it, you're already behind. I opened an empty jug pen and made sure the latch seated clean. I turned the radio on and clipped it to my jacket. The volume stayed low. Out here, loud feels wrong, like you're trying to prove something. Boone padded over and leaned his shoulder into my leg, heavy and calm. Chip stayed a few steps back, eyes flicking between me and the pens, always working even when he was still. "Stay put," I told Boone, trying to sound calm. He didn't move far, just sat where he could watch the shed door like it was his job, which I guess it was. I walked the shed once more before I touched anything else, just to make sure I wasn't missing the simple problems. Water buckets full enough, panels straight, nothing a goat could snag a collar on. I nudged a feed lid down with my boot until it sat flush. I checked the little first aid kit Marshall had pointed out, more out of habit than belief, and made sure the roll of gauze was actually there and not just an empty wrapper. The radio hissed with low static when I turned it up a notch. No voices, just that soft electronic breath. I turned it back down and clipped it where it wouldn't bang on a gate. I didn't want to startle the animals, and I didn't want to hear my own nervousness amplified through plastic. Outside, the cold had that dry bite that makes your nose sting. I took a minute by the truck, drank a mouthful of water, and ate half the protein bar without tasting it. Then I went right back to the work, because thinking was the part that got me in trouble. Work kept me honest. The first loop through the shed was quiet. I counted heads the way you do when you want your hands to stop shaking. You don't barge into a kidding shed. You step in, let the animals register you, keep your light low and red, and look for the obvious things first. Who's standing, who's down, who's breathing hard, who's staring straight ahead like pain has taken up all the room in their body. Most of them were fine, resting, chewing, shifting in straw. A couple lifted their heads and watched me like I was an inconvenience. One doe stood in the corner with her nose pressed into the bedding like she was trying to hide in it. I made a note, not because it was an emergency, just because it was different. Daisy was the one I watched longer. She was up, then down, then up again, pawing the straw into a shallow nest and then wrecking it, like she couldn't decide what she wanted. Her sides tightened now and then, not full contractions, but the kind of building pressure that tells you the clock is moving. I'd seen it enough times to know what it meant. Close, but not yet. I wrote it down in the logbook right there, on the shelf, with my gloves still clean. Daisy restless, pawing, up and down, no discharge, eating a little, watching. I kept the wording plain. The log isn't a diary, it's a chain of facts. Each time I wrote in the logbook, the ink came out a little slower, like the pen didn't love the temperature. I kept my handwriting plain and blocky. If I got called away, I wanted to be able to read it later without guessing what I'd meant. I'd seen too many mornings where everybody was tired and somebody swore they'd check something and nobody could prove it. Then I backed out and shut the door behind me without slamming it. Outside, the wind hit my face like cold water. I pulled my collar up and walked to the truck for the fence tester and the map. Marshall's circles on the map were simple, but out in the dark, everything looks the same until you learn it. The first test point was close enough that I could see the yard light if I turned around. That mattered more than I wanted to admit. I walked the line with my flashlight angled down, looking for grass touching the wire, listening for that faint crackle you get when a fence is working hard. The tester gave me a solid reading, clean and steady. I didn't feel relief so much as I felt a box check itself off in my head. On the fence checks, I didn't just chase numbers, I listened. A hot fence has a sound if you stand close enough and the wind isn't tearing it away. I looked for the spots where frozen grass leaned in, where the wire sagged a hair, where a post looked like it had shifted in the ground. I swept my light across the field now and then, not expecting monsters, just watching for the dull shine of eyes and the low shape of something moving. Coyotes don't announce themselves. They wait, and then you find out what they wanted in the morning. I came back in and made another loop. Same pattern. Quiet entry, count, observe, listen, write it down. The rhythm started to settle me. Work has a way of shrinking your fear down to something you can carry. A little later, one of the does started to shift different, not Daisy. Another one, smaller, dark coat, the kind that always looks like she's wearing a shadow. She went from restless to focused, head down, legs braced, and I felt that little click in my mind. I set my light where it would stay red and low. I pulled on the long gloves and waded through a contraction without touching her. On the next push, I saw the kid's nose and feet right where they should be. Normal presentation, no backward legs, no stuck shoulder. Easy, I muttered, more to myself than the animals. When she pushed again, the kid slid out and hit the straw, slick and quiet. For a second, it didn't move. Then it twitched, coughed, and tried to lift its head like it was offended by the world. I cleared the membrane from its nose and mouth, wiped its face, and rubbed its ribs until it made a thin, irritated sound. That sound meant lungs. That sound meant air. "Good girl," I said softly. I dipped the cord with iodine and moved the doe and kid into a jug pen while the mother was still locked onto the smell and the feel of it. The latch clicked, and I checked it without thinking. The doe immediately turned and started licking the kid, rough and thorough. The kid wobbled on its legs, tried to stand, failed, and tried again. I watched the breathing, waited for the first clumsy nursing attempt, and only then stepped back. I logged it. Clean birth, cord dipped, jugged, kid breathing, vocal, trying to nurse. The words were plain, but my hands had stopped shaking. Outside, I did the second fence point. Farther out, the cold felt sharper and the dark felt deeper. The tester read fine again. I scanned the line for anything leaning into it and didn't find much besides wind and frozen grass. A bell chimed once out in the pasture, faint. I stopped, listened, then kept moving when it didn't repeat. Back at the shed, Daisy had changed in small ways. She wasn't pacing as much. She stood with her head low, eyes half-lidded, breathing heavier. She'd paw a spot, circle once, then stand still like she was listening to her own body. When she laid down, it looked deliberate, not restless. I opened another jug pen and set out fresh towels. I checked the heat lamps but left them unplugged. I didn't want more light in there than I needed. The night fell into a pattern. Shed check, notes, fence check, repeat. I kept my movements small and calm. The goats settled and rose and settled again, and the shed sounds became familiar, like the building itself had a heartbeat. I did the third fence point on foot and regretted it halfway there. The cold got inside my sleeves. My breath made a little fog in my light beam. The reading was still safe. I turned back and watched the yard light float over the dark like a weak moon. On the way back, I noticed one of the outer pen gates wasn't sitting right. It wasn't wide open, just not latched the way it should have been. The chain was still there, hanging, but the hook wasn't seated. I stared at it, trying to rewind my own actions. I could picture my hand on that latch earlier. I could picture the click. I could also picture a goat rubbing against it, or the wind vibrating the panel until the hook jumped. Plenty of things can happen in the dark that aren't supernatural. I fixed it and gave the chain an extra wrap so it couldn't bounce free. Then I wrote it down, boring and straight. Outer gate hook found unseated, secured. No damage. Inside the shed, Daisy finally started to work. Not chaos, just the slow, steady push of it. She'd press, then breathe, then press again. I watched for the first sign of a kid and waited. Waiting is part of the job, and it's the part that makes you sloppy if you let it. Around the edges of my thoughts, I kept feeling that urge to rush, to get the night over with. That's what desperation does. It makes you want to skip steps. I pushed back by making the steps automatic. Check, note, return, repeat. You've got one job tonight, I muttered. Do it clean. Boone got up at one point and walked a slow circle outside the shed, sniffing the air. Chip followed, quick and light. They paused at the edge of the yard light and stared out into the dark, ears forward, bodies still. I froze and listened. I didn't hear anything except wind and distant goats. After a few seconds, they turned back like they'd checked something and decided it wasn't worth their time. Daisy's labor didn't turn ugly. It stayed steady. When the kid finally came, it came the right way. I helped only as much as needed, guiding, not yanking, keeping the nose clear. It was messy and loud for a minute, then quiet again. Daisy started licking immediately, fierce and focused. The kid shook, coughed, and found its voice. I didn't feel proud. I felt relieved. That's different. Pride makes you careless. Relief makes you careful. I set Daisy and her kid in a jug pen, latched it, then checked it again. I logged the basics. Kid breathing, responsive. Daisy attentive. Nursing attempt within minutes. My sleeves smelled like iodine and straw and the sour edge of adrenaline. After Daisy and her kid were settled, I rinsed my hands in cold water that felt like knives and tossed the used towels into a bucket to deal with later. My back ached the way it always does after a night of bending and waiting. I kept checking myself for that creeping impatience, that urge to do one last loop and call it good. I didn't. I did the loop anyway. I checked latches with my fingers, not my eyes. I listened to the steady suck and pause of nursing and let it convince me the night was doing what nights are supposed to do. The rest of the night tapered. The wind kept working the buildings, but nothing broke. The fence stayed hot. The goats settled into half-sleep, blinking slow when I passed. The kid in the first jug pen nursed strong now, and its mother stood over it like she'd do battle with anything that came close. Toward the end, the sky in the east lightened by degrees, black easing into gray. The yard light didn't feel as alone. The shadows looked more honest. I stood in the doorway of the shed and watched my breath drift out into the cold, and for the first time since the old farm gate had been chained shut, I felt a small, dangerous thing. I felt like maybe this job was exactly what it looked like. 3 nights of hard work, money in my hand at sunrise, no mystery, no story, just routine. I wanted to believe that so badly I could taste it. Morning can't be that far, I said quietly. And when the first real daylight finally showed, I started thinking I'd be fine as long as I kept doing the same simple things over and over. The second night started easier, and that was the problem. I drove back out there with the first sunrise still sitting in my bones, the kind of tired that doesn't feel dangerous until it does. I'd slept in chunks, ate whatever was left in my kitchen, and told myself the hard part was over. I'd already handled a clean berth. I'd already made it through the quiet. I'd already proven I could do the work without making it a circus. 2 down, 1 to go. The high plains looked almost friendly in daylight. Flat land, long sight lines, the kind of open space that makes you think you'll see trouble coming. When the sun dropped and the wind picked up, that confidence followed me anyway, like a bad habit. Marshall wasn't there, obviously. Just his buildings, his pens, his fence stretching out into the distance, and the goats that acted like I was late bringing feed. I went through my setup the same way I had the night before. Red lens checked, gloves and iodine within reach, jug pen ready, radio clipped, logbook on the shelf. If I treated it like routine, it felt like routine. I opened the logbook and flipped back to my notes from night 1. Everything looked normal. My blocky handwriting, plain facts, Daisy's birth recorded, gate latch note, fence readings noted in a simple way, nothing that would make a person raise an eyebrow. Then I saw a line I didn't remember writing. It wasn't a spooky message. It wasn't my name scratched into the paper or some dramatic warning. It was a normal farm note, the kind of boring thing you write when you're trying to be responsible. Something like a reminder about Daisy's jug pen and a supply note, written the way I would write it. Short, practical, no extra words. And it had a time reference in it that didn't match my loops. I stared at it, waited for my brain to produce the memory. That's what you do when something doesn't line up. You assume you forgot because forgetting is normal. But the memory didn't show up. I knew where I'd been when that note claimed to exist. I knew what I'd been doing. I'd been outside, walking to a fence point, feeling the cold cut into my wrists. I hadn't been in the shed. I hadn't been holding that pen. "That's not my handwriting," I said under my breath. The words sounded stupid the second they left my mouth, because it did look like mine. That was the part that made my stomach go tight. If it was clearly someone else's, I could have blamed a prank, a neighbor, Marshall coming back early. But it looked like my hand on a different night. I flipped through the rest of the pages like I'd catch another lie. Nothing else jumped out, just that one line sitting there, pretending it belonged. I forced myself to keep moving. If I stood there staring at a notebook, I'd build a story out of it, and stories are what get you killed around livestock. You stop doing the work, you miss the obvious, and then you're running. I did my first loop through the shed on red light, slow and quiet. The goats were settled. Daisy was in her jug pen with her kid, both looking fine. The kid lifted its head when I passed and made a thin, annoyed sound, like it wanted something. Daisy's eyes followed me with that flat, wary goat stare, calm but not trusting. I checked her breathing, checked her udder, checked that the kid was warm and not hunched. Everything looked normal. I wrote my own note underneath the strange one, simple and factual, like I was building a fence between me and whatever that line was. Daisy okay. Kid nursing, no discharge, no distress. Then I stepped out and went to the first fence point. The wind was stronger than the night before, and the fence wire made a faint singing sound, tight and bright. The tester read solid. I scanned the line for grass touching wire and found one patch leaning in. I knocked it back with my boot and watched the wire bounce. Nothing dramatic, just normal maintenance. On the way back, I noticed Chip and Boone weren't where they'd been the night before. Boone was sitting farther from the shed, facing outward, looking into the dark like he was guarding the horizon. Chip paced a small circle behind him, quick steps, then stopped and stared in the same direction. It could have been a rabbit. It could have been a coyote drifting closer than Boone liked. It could have been nothing. Dogs read the world in smells and movement. Half the time they're reacting to something that happened an hour ago. I still didn't like the way Boone's body had gone stiff, not tense like he wanted to attack, still like he didn't want to move first. I went back into the shed and did another loop, mostly because it gave me something to do with my hands. That's when I saw the white overhead light. It was on. Not flickering, not half on, fully on, throwing flat light across the straw and the goats, bleaching the room until it looked wrong. I knew I hadn't turned it on. I'd left it off the way Marshall's sheet said to. I used red light. I treated the shed like a place you didn't startle. There was no one in there, no footsteps, no open door, no moving shadow by the switch, just the light, humming like it had been on for a while. I walked straight to the switch and killed it. No, not tonight, I muttered as I killed the white light. The shed dropped back into red and dim, and for a second I just stood there like the rule sheet said, not because I believed in magic, because I believed in pattern, because spooking a doe in labor can cascade into chaos, and because when you're alone out here, you don't waste calm. I listened. Goats shifting, a soft chew, a kid's faint bleat, the distant wind pushing boards. Nothing else. After the 10 seconds, I stepped in and checked faces and posture like I always did. No one looked like they'd panicked. No one was piled up. No one was breathing hard. If the light had startled them, they'd recovered fast. I logged it anyway. White overhead found on, switched off, animals calm. Writing it down felt like a way of pinning it to the page so it couldn't float around in my head. I ran my next fence check and told myself I was going to stop thinking about it. The second test point was farther out, beyond the yard light's reach. The dark out there wasn't special. It was just big. The kind of dark you can walk into and realize you're a small moving target with no audience. The fence reading was fine at first. Then, for a half second, it dipped. Not a slight wobble. A clean drop under the safe threshold, like someone had opened a door. My thumb tightened on the tester. I took the reading again. It jumped back up like it had never happened. I stood there with my breath freezing in my beard and waited for the explanation to arrive. Wind can cause weird contact. A wet grass clump can brush the wire and steal voltage. A loose connection can hiccup. All true, all normal. The clean drop and snapback was what bothered me. It felt like a blink. I didn't start walking the line to find the problem. I didn't follow that urge to prove I was smarter than a checklist. Marshall's sheet had been clear about not freelancing at night. If you chase a fence line in the dark, you trip, you snag, you get tangled, you end up alone in a place the dogs don't want to go. So I did what the sheet said. I went back in, got tools, and treated it like a routine issue, even though my nerves had started buzzing under my skin. When I came back with the basic kit and took the reading again, it was steady. That made me angry in a quiet way. Not at the fence, at the situation. At the part of me that wanted certainty and wasn't going to get it. Back in the yard, Chip followed close behind my leg. Boone kept watching the dark, eyes fixed, ears up. I walked toward the gate that led to the outer pens, the one I'd used the night before without thinking. Chip slowed. He didn't stop completely. He didn't tuck his tail or whine. He just hesitated, a small hitch like he'd hit an invisible line. Then he stepped forward again, like he'd changed his mind. I stopped anyway, because the rule wasn't about drama. It was about the dogs. They knew this land better than I did, and they didn't waste fear. "Come on, Chip," I said quietly. Chip looked at me, then past me, then moved through the gate, but it wasn't the same easy confidence. Boone didn't follow. Boone held position and kept staring into nothing like it was full of something. I didn't see anything, no eyeshine, no shape, no movement, just the wind and the fence and the sense that the space past the gate had gotten heavier. I backed out and shut the gate, and I told myself I was being stupid. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the weird log note was just me forgetting. I told myself the light had been left on by Marshall and I'd never noticed because I was busy. I told myself the fence hiccup was a loose connection settling in the cold. I told myself the dogs were reacting to a coyote downwind. It's fine, I told myself, not believing it. I tried calling Marshall anyway because part of me wanted to hear a human voice say it was normal. There was no service out there, so I tried the radio like that would help, even though I already knew it wouldn't. The radio hissed back at me like a joke. I went back to the shed and forced myself into routine. Count, watch, listen, write it down. The goats didn't care about my nerves. Daisy's kid nursed. Another doe shifted in straw, not ready yet. The shed held its own steady sounds, and I tried to let them pull me back into sanity. The rest of the night stayed mostly quiet. No screaming animals, no frantic births, no obvious predators. But every loop had an extra edge to it now. I kept noticing small things and having to decide if they mattered. A gate creak that didn't match the wind. A bell sound that came once and never repeated. A faint click in the rafters that could have been settling wood, or could have been something else entirely if you let your brain run wild. I didn't let it run. I clamped down on process and did what the sheet told me to do. I kept my light red. I wrote notes immediately. I didn't chase the fence line. I paid attention to the dogs. I stayed inside the edges of what I could explain. By the time the sky started to lighten again, I was exhausted in a different way than the first night. The first night had been work tired. This was decision tired, like my brain had been lifting weight all night, trying to keep a story from forming. Morning came the same way it always does, slow and pale over empty land. I made my final notes and stood in the shed doorway watching the light creep in. I'd followed the sheet. I'd made it to daylight. That should have felt like a win. Instead, it felt like something had let me through. Like I'd done what it wanted, and in return it hadn't made it worse. Yet, the third night didn't start like a horror movie. It started like a night that didn't have room for mistakes. I drove out there with my jaw tight and my shoulders already sore, telling myself I'd finish what I started. One more night after this, one more sunrise, money in my hand. Then I could breathe for a second, long enough to figure out what I was going to do about the farm that owed me and the nursing home that didn't care. The sky was clear and hard, and the cold had settled deep into the land, the kind of cold that makes metal sound sharper when it moves. The yard light was on when I pulled in, steady and pale, like it had been left burning just to prove it could. The buildings looked the same as they had every other night. Same barn, same shed, same fence line vanishing into dark. But the place sounded different, not louder, quieter. The goats weren't noisy when I arrived. No arguing bleats, no impatient stamping, no scattered bells chiming as bodies shifted. Just a low, held silence that made the wind seem louder by comparison. Like the whole farm had stopped clearing its throat. I told myself it was nothing. Animals get quiet sometimes. Weather changes. Predators move through and the herd listens. That's normal. I went straight into the kidding shed with my red light because I didn't want to stand outside thinking about it. The air inside held that familiar mix of hay and warm bodies, but even that felt thinner, like the heat had pulled back into corners. Daisy was up when I first checked her, then down again fast, breathing heavier than the night before. Her belly tightened and released with a rhythm that made my own breath match it. Her eyes were wide and glossy, not panicked, just focused the way animals get when the body takes over. I opened a jug pen and made sure the latch seated. I set towels and iodine where I could reach without stepping over panels. I checked the gloves, then checked them again, like my hands needed the reassurance. I didn't turn on a heat lamp. I didn't want extra light. I didn't want to give the shed a reason to feel any bigger than it already did. I wrote a short note in the logbook. Daisy active labor. Strong contractions, watching closely. Nothing fancy. Just truth. Then I did what I'd done the last 2 nights. I kept moving. Routine is how you stay out of your own head. I walked out for the first fence point, tester in one hand, flashlight in the other. The wires sang faintly in the wind. The reading came back solid, a clean number that should have been comforting. I scanned the line and didn't see any grass leaning in. Everything looked fine. On the way back, I checked the dogs. Boone was already up, sitting at the edge of the yard light like a boulder somebody had placed there. Chip paced a tight little half circle, then froze, ears forward. Neither dog looked at me when I spoke their names. They were looking past me, past the pens, past the fence, into the kind of open dark that's supposed to be empty. I stopped and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no rustle, no coyote yip. Just wind and the faint creak of wire and boards. I walked back into the shed and checked Daisy again. She'd shifted her position. She was breathing harder now, pushing into the straw with her forelegs. That told me things were moving. I watched for the first sign of a kid. Nothing yet, but her contractions were strong enough that I was starting to worry about a bad presentation. I've seen goats try to push for too long and get exhausted. I've seen does refuse to settle and waste energy, standing up and lying down like they're trying to outrun labor. When it goes wrong fast. I stayed close for a few minutes, and then I forced myself back into my loop. If I hovered and got anxious, I'd miss something else. If I stuck to routine, I'd catch trouble early. That was the logic I kept feeding myself, over and over. Then the bell started moving. It wasn't close at first, just a faint chime from out in the pasture, one of those sounds you barely notice until it repeats. But this time it didn't repeat in the same place. It shifted, fast, like a goat was trotting, then running, like a bell was swinging hard with every step. At the same time, the shed went still, not quiet in the normal way. Quiet like a room full of people holding their breath. Even the soft chewing stopped. Even the little straw shift noises died down. The air felt tight in my chest. I stood there with the red light in my hand and listened. The bell kept moving out there, quick and uneven, then stopped. Then it chimed again, farther to the left, like it had jumped. My first thought was exactly what the rule sheet warned me about. Bell moving fast while the shed goes too still. Don't rush out. Stand at the door. Listen. Scan from a distance. Make sure the dogs are where they need to be. I did that. I went to the shed doorway and looked out into the yard light. I killed my flashlight for a second, like the sheet said, and let my eyes adjust. All I could see was the circle of light and the fence posts beyond it, the dark pass that was flat and deep. Chip and Boone were in the same place, Boone sitting, Chip standing, both looking out like statues. I turned my red light back on and took a step out, more to show myself I could. That's when I noticed Daisy's pen was open. It wasn't wide open, not like someone had swung the gate and left it. The latch was unhooked, the panel pushed just enough that an animal could slip through if it wanted to. I stared at it, and my brain tried to offer the simple explanation. Maybe I'd forgotten to seat it. Maybe Daisy bumped it with her shoulder in a contraction. Maybe a goat leaned on it just right. Then I looked inside the pen. Empty. My pulse spiked so fast it made my ears ring. Daisy wasn't the kind of doe that wandered. She was heavy, in labor, and she'd been in that pen minutes ago. She shouldn't have had the energy to slip out and go anywhere, and even if she did, she wouldn't go far. I moved through the shed, scanning corners and bedding, checking behind panels like she'd found a stupid spot to lie down. Nothing. No Daisy, no movement, no sound. I stepped back into the yard, red light low, and swept it across the closest pens. The goats shifted in the light but didn't spook. I heard the bell again, farther out now, and my stomach sank. I climbed onto the lowest rail and looked out over the pasture. The beam of my light wasn't strong enough to reach far, but the yard light gave me a little help. I saw a shape near the fence line, low to the ground, not moving right. I jumped down and walked fast, not running yet because running makes you stupid. As I got closer, I saw the white of Daisy's flank in the dark. She was down, legs folded under her wrong, head lifted just enough to show she was alive. Her sides hitched. She was straining. Alone. It was the exact situation that turns ranch work into a nightmare. A doe in trouble, away from the shed, away from the jug pens, away from the supplies. A doe that needs help now, not after you've talked yourself into being brave. I stopped at the gate. Chip was there with me, but he didn't go through. He planted his feet and stared past Daisy, past the fence line, into the dark beyond. Boone came up behind us and stopped too, heavy body turned sideways like he was blocking. This was the rule. The one Marshall had made sound like common sense. If the dogs refuse a gate, you don't force it. You don't cross. You don't decide you're smarter than the animals that live out here. I could feel my hands wanting to shake. I could feel my brain searching for the version of this that didn't involve me making a choice. If I went out there, I was breaking the sheet. I was stepping past the line the dogs wouldn't cross. If I didn't go out there, Daisy was going to suffer and maybe die, and the kid with her. I'd lose the animal on my watch. I'd lose the pay. I'd go back into town with my gas needle near empty and the nursing home invoice sitting in my glove box like a weight. I'd sit at that wobbly table again and do math that didn't work out. Only this time I'd be doing it with the added fact that I'd walked away from an animal that needed me. That's what made it feel unavoidable. Not courage, not curiosity, pressure. I took a breath and tried to keep my voice steady. "Come on," I muttered, trying to stay calm. "Chip, let's go," I said, forcing it. Chip didn't move. He didn't whine. He didn't look confused. He looked certain. I stared at Daisy, watching her strain, watching her head lift and drop like she was fighting her own body. The bell chimed once somewhere behind her, and I couldn't tell which animal it belonged to. I couldn't even tell if it belonged to an animal at all. I felt the moment slide into place, like a door closing. "Fine," I said quietly, and stepped through anyway. The ground on the other side felt the same under my boots, but the air changed. The wind didn't get stronger. It got different, like it had a rhythm now, like it was breathing around me instead of just passing through. Daisy's eyes rolled toward me when I got close, the whites showing in thin crescents. She was down in the hard grass near the fence, belly tight, hind legs shaking with every push. Up close, I could see the froth at the edge of her mouth, the way her breath came short and fast like she'd been running. She wasn't in a normal spot. She wasn't in a normal situation. All the instincts in me said the same thing at once. Get her moving. Get her back to light. Get her back to where the tools are. I kept my red light low and angled at the ground so I wouldn't blow her eyes out. I crouched beside her shoulder and put a hand on her neck, feeling the tremor under her skin. Her coat was damp with sweat despite the cold. "Get up," I told her, my voice coming out rough. She tried. Her front legs pushed, then slipped. She made a sound that wasn't quite a bleat, more like a strained grunt, and her body tightened again. I couldn't see a kid. Not yet. That could mean it wasn't time. It could mean the kid was positioned wrong. It could mean she'd been pushing long enough that everything was swelling and closing up on itself. I didn't have the luxury of guessing from out here. I hooked my hand under her collar and pulled, not hard enough to choke her, just enough to shift her weight. I braced my shoulder against her side and pushed. Daisy fought me for a second, then her body remembered what it was supposed to do. She got her front legs under her. Her hind end lagged. She nearly went down again. I shoved her forward, one step at a time. The fence was close enough that I could hear it, not just the faint crackle you sometimes catch if you stand near a working line. This was louder, a steady hum under the wind, like the charger was working overtime. It didn't make sense. The fence had read fine at the test points. The wire shouldn't have sounded alive. A bell chimed behind me. One clean ring, too close. I turned my head and swept my light. Nothing. No goat, no shadow moving in the grass, just darkness and the faint shine of frost on weeds. The bell chimed again, farther to the left, and it didn't match any footsteps I could track. Sound doesn't move like that in open air unless something is carrying it. Daisy lurched forward again, and I had to focus on her or she'd go down. I steered her toward the gate and the yard light beyond it. Every step felt like a negotiation. The wind pushed at my back with that different rhythm, and my skin prickled like my body knew it before my mind did. The fence hum deepened, then dipped like a breath pulled in. The hot wire went slack. That's the only way I can describe it. The line that should have been tight and straight loosened, drooped, and bowed toward me as if someone had grabbed it out in the dark and yanked. For one stunned half-second, I just stared, because it broke the rules of how fences behave. Wire doesn't do that on its own, not without a post snapping or a tree falling or a truck hitting it. Then it snapped back. The recoil was fast and vicious. The wire whipped up and caught my forearm, where my sleeve had ridden up, right above the glove line. It didn't just hit, it bit. A clean slice and a burn at the same time, like a razor dragged across skin and then kissed with heat. Pain flashed white. Blood welled immediately and ran in a hot line down toward my wrist. I stumbled backward and almost fell, catching myself on my heel. Daisy startled at the motion and tried to bolt, but she was too heavy and too tired. She stumbled instead, and I shoved her forward again, anger and panic mixing into something sharp. The wire was tight again, humming like nothing had happened, like it had always been that way. Like I'd imagined the slack, imagined the snap, imagined the way it reached for me. My arm throbbed. The burn stung the air. I pressed my elbow against my side to keep from clutching at it, because grabbing a fresh cut with dirty hands is how you turn a bad night into an infection that doesn't care about your bills. The bell chimed behind me again. Closer, then not, then close again. It felt like it was circling without moving through space, like the sound was being placed rather than made. The yard light ahead flickered. Just once. A quick, dim, bright pulse that made shadows jump. I pushed Daisy harder. She bleated, high and angry, and that sound cut through the weird quiet like a knife. For the first time since I stepped through the gate, the goats in the pens answered, a few scattered calls like they'd been holding it in and finally remembered how to be loud. The shed light flickered again, and through the open gap at the corner of the building, I saw the white overhead inside click on. Not a slow warm-up, not a faulty bulb sputtering. It was on like a switch had been flipped. It didn't make sense from where I stood. The shed door was shut. No one was in there. I hadn't touched the switch, but the light was on, bright and flat, spilling through the cracks like a signal. For a stupid, dangerous second, my brain tried to connect it to what I wanted. Light means safety. Light means inside. Light means tools and towels and iodine and control. The bell chimed again, and it sounded like it was right at my shoulder. My skin went cold under the sweat. I turned fast, red light swinging wide, and there was still nothing there. No eyeshine, no shape, no movement in the grass, just empty air. That's when the thought hit. Not a voice in the wind, not words spoken aloud. It landed behind my eyes with the same force as a shove, like someone had reached into my skull and pressed a thumb into the soft part of my brain. You don't get to leave. It wasn't a sentence I'd come up with. It didn't sound like me. It didn't sound like anything I had ever told myself. It felt like a claim, like a rule. Not mine, I muttered when that thought hit. My mouth tasted like metal. My heartbeat was loud enough that I could hear it. Daisy strained again, and I felt her body lock up under my hands, and the awful truth of it was simple. I was out here bleeding, alone, with an animal in labor, and something had just told me I didn't get to decide when this ended. I didn't have the luxury of arguing with a thing I couldn't see. I didn't have the luxury of standing still either. I shoved Daisy forward. She stumbled through the gate into the yard light, and I practically dragged her the last few steps. My arm left warm streaks on my jacket where the blood smeared. I slammed the gate behind us so hard the metal rang. The sound felt like an answer. Chip and Boone were on the yard side now, both moving at once like a switch had flipped in them. Chip rushed to Daisy's flank and tried to herd her toward the shed. Boone took 2 steps toward the dark, stopped, and bristled, his whole body rigid. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He held a line like there was something in front of him that he refused to cross. The yard light flickered again. The fence hum behind us softened as if it had relaxed. I looked toward the shed and saw the white overhead still on inside, bright through the cracks. It felt like it was calling me, like it wanted me to step in and stop thinking. I remembered Marshall's sheet, red light. Stand still, don't chase, don't cross where the dogs won't go, don't improvise. I wanted to laugh, and I wanted to throw up. I'm leaving, I snapped, even though no one was there. Then I did the only smart thing I'd done all night. I stopped talking. I stopped trying to understand. I went back to procedure. I got Daisy into the shed as calmly as I could, keeping my light red even though the white overhead was burning. I killed the overhead at the switch with my bloody elbow because my hands were shaking. I shut the door and latched it, then checked the latch twice. I set Daisy into a pen where she couldn't bolt, and I moved like every step mattered because now I knew it did. The pain in my arm kept pulsing, sharp with every heartbeat. I wrapped it with gauze from the kit, tight enough to slow the bleeding, not so tight my fingers went numb. I didn't clean it the way I should have. There wasn't time. Daisy strained again, and this time I saw it, the first sign of the kid, and the world narrowed to that small, brutal job. I stayed with her. I kept my movements controlled. I helped only when I had to, and I didn't look toward the door unless I needed to. The dog stayed close, Boone like a wall outside, Chip like a shadow at my heel. The shed creaked in the wind. The fence hummed faintly, then quieted. Somewhere out in the pasture, a bell chimed once far away, and I didn't answer it with my eyes. I made it to morning by obeying the sheet again, like the rules were the only thing it respected. Dawn didn't feel like relief. It felt like a timer that finally stopped screaming. I stayed in the shed until the sky went from black to a washed-out gray. Goats shifting, a kid bleeding, wind easing off. I didn't wait for warm. I waited for real. My forearm was wrapped in gauze and duct tape, because that's what I had. The bandage was already spotted through, and every time I flexed my fingers, the cut burned. I cleaned what I could with cold water and a rough paper towel. It wasn't proper. It was enough to drive. I packed fast, flashlight back on the hook, fence tester in its case. Logbook closed, one last line written in plain ink that didn't explain anything. Daisy and her kid were alive. That was the only fact that mattered. I latched the shed, checked it twice, then walked to my truck like I was leaving a place that didn't want witnesses. I drove with my bad arm pinned against my ribs, shoulders tight, fingers numb from gripping the wheel too hard. When I finally got cell service again, I didn't call anyone. Marshall came back later that morning. He didn't ask how my night was. He looked at my arm first, then at my face, then passed me toward the pens like he could read the story without hearing it. "You're done," Marshall said. He kept his eyes on my bandage a beat too long, like he was matching it to something he'd already seen. "Good. Now you know why I wrote that sheet," Marshall said quietly. He counted out cash like it was feed money, placed it in my hand, and nodded once. No apology, no comfort, just business. In the yard light, I saw his scar again, that old pale line on his hand, and my stomach tightened with the delayed understanding. I'd seen it when he handed me the keys. I'd chalked it up to ranch work. Now it matched my arm too well to be a coincidence. I folded the bills, stuffed them into my wallet, and did the math immediately. Nursing home first, then rent, then gas, nothing left for pride. He turned and started checking latches, calm and methodical, like this was just another morning and the farm needed doing. He didn't look surprised. That was the part that scared me most. I left without shaking his hand. I didn't trust my voice not to do something stupid. Hours later, back in my rental, I washed my arm properly and tried to eat. The place smelled like detergent and old carpet. Normal. Safe. I turned on the faucet to rinse a cup, and the pipes knocked once, the way they always did in cold weather. Then, mixed in with that knock, I heard a single soft chime, like a little bell tapped with a fingernail. Just once. Then nothing.